Hello and welcome everybody to the Macmillan Center. I'm Ian Shapiro, the director. We're delighted to host Minister Rory Stewart as this year's George Herbert Walker Jr. Lecturer in International Studies. The Honorable George Herbert Walker III, Yale College class of 1953, established this lecture series in 1986 to commemorate his father, a distinguished graduate of the Yale class of 1927. The Walker Lecture has featured eminent practitioners and scholars, including Madeleine Albright, John Major, Richard Holbrooke, and UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Minister Stewart, who's currently the Minister for Prisons in the UK, is a Member of Parliament for Penrith and The Border, the largest geographical constituency in England. He is an accomplished author, senior diplomat, philanthropist, and a documentary filmmaker. In January 2018, he was appointed Minister of State for the Ministry of Justice, having previously been the Minister of State for Africa at both the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the Department for International Development. As I said, he's now moved on to take responsibility for, you said 180 prisons? You said, yeah. So we were commenting that perhaps this is the beginning of a, like Tocqueville before him, coming to America to study the prison system, which will lead to a new book on democracy in America. His previous career was in foreign affairs, particularly focused on military intervention and international development. While on leave from the Foreign Service, he worked for 21 months crossing Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Nepal, and stayed in 500 village houses during his journey. From 2005 to 2008, Stewart was chair and chief executive of the Turquoise Mountain Foundation based in Kabul, which he grew from 100 to 300 employees. He also restored a section of the old city, established a clinic, primary school, and arts institute, and he brought Afghan crafts to the international market. Stewart has written 4 books: The Places in Between, a New York Times bestseller that describes his walk across Afghanistan in the winter of 2001 and 2002, Occupational Hazards, or The Prince of the Marshes, his account of his time as an administrator in southern Iraq, The Marshes, which describes a walk through Cumbria and the borders with his father, and Can Intervention Work, an essay on military intervention, which is close to the subject that he's going to speak about today. As a filmmaker, Stewart has presented 3 BBC television documentaries: In Search of Lawrence of Arabia, Afghanistan, The Great Game, and Border Country, The Story of Britain's Lost Middle Land. Stewart has been awarded the Order of the British Empire for his work in Iraq, the Gold Medal of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society for his work in Afghanistan, the Spirit of Scotland Award, the Radio France Award, the Prize del Camino del Cid for his books, a Scottish BAFTA for his documentary making, and honorary doctorates from Stirling University and the American University of Paris. The title he has chosen for today's lecture is Failed States and How Not to Fix Them. I'm pleased to introduce Minister Rory Stewart. Welcome.
Well, thank you all very, very much indeed. First thing, can you hear me clearly? Yeah. Great. So thank you for coming, and I'm going to try to speak relatively briefly and then turn this into more of a conversation rather than a formal lecture, given the size of the room. And I wanted to begin by trying to draw out some of my own personal experience, as somebody who went from being a practitioner on the ground. So I began my career working in Indonesia, in Bosnia, in Kosovo. I then worked in Iraq and then in Afghanistan, and moved from that to being a minister. I'm going to try to reflect a little bit on what it means to be a minister. And I wanted to begin by sharing with you my experience just over a year ago, a year and a half ago, when I became the Minister for International Development, responsible initially for Middle East and Asia, and then Africa. I had a budget for which I was responsible of about $7.5 billion US a year. And I had to spend that money every year because the British government had signed up to spending 0.7% of GDP on international aid. So every day crossing my desk came these business cases for different spending decisions. So any spending decision over £10 million, I had to sign off. And as you can imagine, when you're trying to spend $6.5 billion, there's a lot of those spending decisions. So I sit there every day, and every day on my desk is, would you like to spend $220 million on an education program in Ethiopia? Would you like to spend $42 million on training political parties in Bangladesh? Would you like to spend $15 million on a healthcare project in Upper Tanzania, right? And this whole environment, this whole context, is of course something that comes out of a very, very exciting, very inspirational vision, post-war vision, about the role that wealthy countries can play in the developing world. This sum of money, in fact, this 0.7% of GDP spent on international aid, reflects a huge international commitment that began to emerge in the 1970s when economists calculated that if all the wealthy countries spent 0.7% of their GDP on international aid, they would be able to end poverty by the year 2000, right? This didn't quite happen, but the commitment remains, so that Scandinavian countries, Britain and now Germany, have now met this 0.7% target. And the focus of our work, of course, over this period has narrowed. So whereas in the 1970s we were very concerned with countries like China, India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, now increasingly we are preoccupied with fragile states, and particularly failed states. So let's just start with that as an example. And in order to do this, I need my chalk. I have my chalk. Yeah. And I have a box of chalk. The professor would find a box of chalk. I've got very spoilt recently because we have whiteboards in Britain which allow me to write in red and blue and green, but you're just going to have to get me scratching in white. So I'm just going to start by putting up on the board here as a way of getting the conversation going a list of countries, right? So that's the Central African Republic. That's the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's Burundi. Liberia. Niger. Anyone like to try to guess what those 5 countries are? What those 5 countries we generate? What are they supposed to be, those 5 countries, if you're a minister dealing with this kind of stuff? Idea what those 5 countries are?
Sub-Saharan.
Okay, they're sub-Saharan African countries, but in addition to that, they are, in terms of normal GDP per capita, they are supposed to be the 5 poorest countries in the world at the moment, right? And over here, I'm just going to put another list of countries. South Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, Chad Basin. Any thoughts on those 4? What have we got going on there? Yeah. These are the major humanitarian emergencies at the moment. This is where the large UN appeals are taking place. Appeals for $2-3 billion. This is UNICEF, World Food Programme. These are the big famines which people have been leaning into over the last couple of years. Right now, would anyone like to begin to generate? So imagine, you are now in my position. You are now the minister responsible for international development. You're meant to be spending your $6.5 billion a year, and you're supposed to be addressing the issues of these countries, the poorest countries, countries where people are on the case of the Central African Republic, where in terms of GDP per capita, people are supposed to be on about $2 a day, but it's a very unequal society, so very few people are actually making $2 a day. And you're meant to be dealing with these countries in which, take Somalia, 2011, nearly 150,000 people starved to death in a 2-month period, including a number of children. When I was in northern Somalia last year, I went to emergency nutrition centers where I could see children getting tubes put in their noses by UNICEF in order to try to keep them alive, children who hadn't eaten for 2 weeks. Okay, so what are the problems with these countries? What's involved in trying to deal with these countries? What are we supposed to be doing about these countries? How are you going to spend your money? Can I have an idea from the audience? It doesn't need to be a very serious idea. I'm just trying to get the conversation going. Some thought.
Build infrastructure.
All right, infrastructure. Okay, let's put some infrastructure. Okay, now, infrastructure, of course, is something that we were building a great deal in all these countries in the 1960s and early 1970s. In fact, if you travel, as I did recently through the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you are perpetually coming across roads which were funded at various times by the US government, by the Soviet Union, by the Belgians, and those roads have largely collapsed. So does anyone want to just speculate a little bit about what the fundamental problem has been with us constructing infrastructure in these countries and why building infrastructure has not really turned those countries around, please? Corruption, okay. Let's think of another problem in DRC, or indeed there. Another fundamental problem, yep. Dictators. Okay, let's yep, okay. Let's put government here. Yep. Civil war. I'm going to put security up here. Civil war. All right. Generate, please. Somebody. More. Health. Education. Food.
Sustainable jobs.
Jobs, yeah. Clean water. Water, yep. That's a big problem if you get to Niger, yep. Women. Sorry, what did somebody say there? Tribalism. Okay, that's a different kind of problem. I'm going to put that up here. All right. Now, what would be the basic analysis for why, despite the fact that we've spent many, many billions of dollars over the last 40, 50 years in those countries, we haven't actually managed to solve the problem? So any number of people from the 1960s onwards, ranging from dedicated missionaries to USAID workers to people working for Save the Children or the United Nations, have gone into those countries and spent an enormous amount of money, and not a great deal has been achieved. Take the next country that would have been on the list. So the sixth poorest country in the world is Malawi. Malawi is a country where the British government, for example, has spent something in the region of £4.5 billion over the last 50 years, and Malawi is, if anything, poorer than it was when we started 50 years ago. What are we doing wrong? What is the problem with this whole model? Yeah?
Trying to build governments in our own image.
Okay. So we've had corruption and trying to build governments in our own image. So I'm going to put up here, and this, of course, is what I'm trying to move towards. The problems basically here, we normally analyze in terms of failed states, right? So the analysis is basically that it doesn't matter how many roads you build. If the government isn't actually going to sustain, maintain, and manage those roads, they will collapse pretty quickly. It doesn't matter how much you spend on healthcare or education. If the education system in the country doesn't work, the healthcare system in the country doesn't work, it's not sustainable. Right? Your money is effectively wasted. Unless you can begin to address some of these issues, tribalism, corruption, civil war, security government, you're not going to be able to sort these problems out. Right. Now, let me then move on to the next stage. So we have an analysis of a problem. We have some very poor countries. And at the heart of the problem is that these countries are basically failed states. We can come later in the conversation to defining exactly what a failed state is. But there's absolutely no doubt that these states have a real problem with what we might call capacity, or what we might call legitimacy, or what we might call security. They don't seem, at least from their capital cities, to control their territory in the way that we might anticipate or expect. Right. Let's then come to the next question. Right. Why does this matter to us? Why do we care about any of this? Why is any of this important to us? Someone want to suggest?
Our insecurity and moral issues.
Okay, exactly. So our insecurity and moral issues. So let's break that down. Let's take Africa, for example. Why do we get upset about Africa? Well, we get upset about Africa firstly because people there are very, very poor, right? So that you have those 150,000 people dying in Somalia in a 6-week period. But also because at the moment in Africa, we are in a situation in which by 2050, 1 in 10 of the children born in the world will be Nigerian. Right? By the end of this century, half the world's population will be from sub-Saharan Africa. At the moment, 18 million sub-Saharan Africans are joining the job market every year, and they are not getting any jobs. Right? If you go to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania at the moment, the unemployment rates amongst youth well over 90%. So if you were trying to guess where the Syria of the future is likely to be, where the failed, fragile states of the future are likely to be, they're likely to come from Africa. If you're thinking about where the migration threats to Europe are likely to be, well, what's going to happen to all these young unemployed people who have no livelihoods or future in Africa? They're going to start crossing the Mediterranean. If you're worrying about where epidemics are likely to come from, because of course epidemics is not just a question of a particular natural environment, it's a question of the state structure's ability to deal with it. What was the problem in Liberia and Sierra Leone with Ebola? The problem fundamentally was the problem of the health system in addressing that. Right? They didn't have proper clinics, they didn't have proper detection systems. It was very, very difficult for them to process people when they became ill. So whether you're worried about security in the form of terrorism, whether you're worried about security in terms of migration, if you're worried about security in terms of epidemics, you may be worried about Africa. And on the positive side, if you're looking for the markets of the future, it's almost certainly to Africa that you would turn. And if there's a labor shortage in Europe, and if there's an excess capital in Europe, then the labor is in Africa. If you're interested in raw materials, right, nearly 10% of the contents of this come from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Right? Democratic Republic of the Congo has the world's largest reserves of coltan, of cobalt, has enormous reserves of rare earth, and all of this is going to be increasingly important. Right? So we have a situation where we have a problem. We have a problem that has significance for us in terms of security and our humanitarian obligations, and a potential opportunity for us. So for all those reasons, we would feel, I guess, that we would want to be able to fix these failed states. Which brings me to my next point. Okay, now, imagine that you have been given the job of trying to fix one of these failed states. Let's take it down from the 9 states that I've put up there, and let's take it down just to Somalia. And imagine yourself sent out as an advisor to the governor of a province somewhere in central Somalia. And I'm going to paint a little picture for it, and then I'm going to give you an opportunity to try to work out what you're going to do about this situation. Right? So, Somalia's been through a civil war. You end up in an office, it's got smashed windows, there's very little furniture, there's a fancy new laptop computer that somehow the governor has acquired from some USAID grant that's arrived before you. And you are being given the job of trying to re-establish the basic conditions of a state in order to generate prosperity, employment, security, and a sustainable future for Somalia. Right? And you are you, right? You are some foreigner. You are employed by USAID, or you're employed by the World Bank, or you're employed by UNICEF, or you're employed by Save the Children, or you're employed by Oxfam, and you've been dumped here, and you're trying to fix this failed state, okay? And you turn up in the governor's office, day one, with your smart clothes on, right? And you're going to have a conversation with the governor, and you're going to try to fix his failed state. Because you know that there's no point you just spending money on infrastructure because it won't be sustained. There's going to be no point just spending money on health and education, it won't be sustained, unless you address the fundamental problems. So what are you going to start by doing? Somebody give me an idea, right? Day one, I've turned up. I'm now in Somalia. Ah, very good. Who was that? That's very good. That's very good. Okay. All right. So I'm going to set up a horrible thing here called us and them. Right? Okay. So this is interesting. So ask his opinion. Okay. All right. Let's go on from that. What other things might we be doing? Yeah.
Broaden the circle of stakeholders.
Okay. Very good. Okay. Very good. Okay. We got a governor. Got a governor. Who might the other stakeholders be? Let's have some stakeholders.
Tribal leaders.
Mm-hmm.
They have mayors or
Yep.
selectmen or whatever.
Okay, let's go to mayor. Churches, very good. Very good, yep. Yep. Let's put a church, a mosque, yep. Women. Okay, let's just pause on this for a second. This is very interesting. How are you facilitating that? How are you setting about working out? How are you meeting these people? How are you getting them in the room? Okay, we need a census, okay? Census, data.
Inventory the assets of the country.
Right, we've got an inventory. Okay. So we've got our data, we've got our inventory. I'm going to come back to some of the problems around this, but it's a good model, right? Data and inventory. We've got our stakeholders who's we've consulting. So I don't know, we've got a, let's say that we've got a, let's put this into pompous language here, and then I'm going to put it up, right? So we're mapping internal and external stakeholders. Right, we're defining critical tasks. We're mobilizing resources. And finally, to finish with my jargon, we are measuring through iterative monitoring. Okay? Well, we're also threatening people. That's interesting. We're threatening people. Okay, we're not threatening people.
By that I mean, not literally threatening them, but you're threatening people who have a stake in the way things are.
Good. Okay, let's come back to that, but that's very good. Okay, I like that.
Where are you mapping the relationship between these people and the power centers?
Power. All right, okay. Now, let me just start on this, because this is actually very interesting what's going on the left-hand side of this board at the moment, right? The traditional model of international development, which has been driven basically for the last 40 years, is not doing what this room in Yale is doing, right? You're an unusual audience. The traditional way in which international development thinks about this is not like that. The traditional way that international development thinks about this is in terms of three things, right? It thinks about problems in terms of best practice, capacity building, and political will. These are the three things, right? So the normal idea is that you turn up in Somalia, you bring your best practice from Vietnam, or wherever it happens to be, right? You then do your capacity building of the governor, right? And then you wait for his political will to implement your wonderful best practice that you've done the capacity building. Now, contained within that, of course, and this is true of almost all international development, is an insult. All you have to do is turn those phrases around to see the insult. So basically what you're saying, if you say somebody needs best practice, capacity building, and political will, is you're basically saying that they are ignorant, unskilled, and idle, right? And that your job is to provide the knowledge, the training, and a bit of oomph. Now, here, on the other hand, this audience in Yale has generated a different kind of model, where you have focused much more on existing power relationships that are already there on the ground, right? And this is absolutely central to the problem in international development. So if you look at Zambia, for example, where we have just wasted a prodigious 55 million on trying to do reform of agricultural subsidies, right? And we've been trying to do this for over 20 years, trying to reform the agricultural subsidy system. So it's a classic international development situation. Some economist turns up, they say, one of the reasons why the economy in Zambia is not going well is because they're subsidizing agricultural inputs too much. They're wasting an enormous amount of money on this. We can reallocate it to much more efficient uses. So we're going to bring in a brilliant economist who's going to sit down with the Ministry of Finance. He's going to explain how agricultural subsidies were removed in Egypt. And by doing so, we're going to unlock economic growth in Tanzania, and everything will be fine. So we need the best practice from Egypt. We do the capacity building in the Ministry of Finance, and then nothing happens, right? And why does nothing happen? We say it's a lack of political will, right? But in fact, we're wrong, right? What's gone wrong is exactly all the stuff that you've just identified here. What's gone wrong is that we haven't understood power relationships. In the case of Zambia and agricultural subsidies, we haven't understood the fact that the entire government owns land, and therefore most of the major ministers involved in decision-making are themselves receiving these agricultural subsidies, and therefore may be quite reluctant to have them removed. Let me give you another question, right, to try to get back into this stuff. I went to see two projects. First one was in Ethiopia, and the second one was in another sub-Saharan African country. And they were identical projects. Right? They were both projects which were about £27 million for rural health clinics. I turn up in Ethiopia at my rural health clinic. It's busy. There are doctors there. There are nurses there. There are young volunteers working on sex education, seeing about 27,000 patients a year. There are fantastic patient records. There are great medicines on the shelves. I then turn up in the second country, right? Absolutely identical program. Same amount of money, same implementing partners, same model. And I turn up in the clinic and there's human excrement on the floor. There's no medicines on the shelves. There are no patient records. There's a fan, but there's no electricity to power it. And of course, there are no patients insane enough to go anywhere near that clinic, right? Okay, so what is the difference between the successful example in Ethiopia and the unsuccessful example in the other country? Does anyone want to generate some thoughts for me?
Local control.
All right. So what's going wrong? So I've given 27 million here at the capital, and here's the clinic. What's gone wrong between that 27 million and the clinic? Someone? Corruption, okay. So how does the corruption work, though? So we got corruption, but give me an example of where the corruption's going, where the money's going.
Take some of the money away.
Okay, so we lose some here. Central government. So the Ministry of Health scoops off about 5% of this money. They need some money in order to do what with it? What would the Ministry of Health want to be doing with this money? Ideas?
Putting it into urban hospitals.
Sorry?
Putting it into urban hospitals.
Very good, very good. I like this audience. Okay, right? This is very important to understand, which is that the corruption is not always, as one could imagine, buying the jacuzzi, right? Often the way that we misunderstand corruption is we imagine in these countries that actually what's happening is the person stealing the money, trousering it, and buying themselves a nice property in London or a Rolls Royce. Now that does happen, of course, right? But that is not the major form of corruption that you're having to deal with, right? So we had a very good example there. Siphoned off for urban hospitals. Why has it been siphoned off for urban hospitals? Please.
Low budget.
Low budgets. Why has he got a low budget for urban hospitals?
No one's giving aid to them?
Correct, because some guy like me has decided I want to put my 27 million into the rural hospitals, and none of the other donors have decided to put any money into urban hospitals because they've done a needs assessment where they've concluded that it's the rural population that needs the money. Even more than that, we may have even decided on an almost theological basis that primary health care is more important than hospitals. So we're not giving any money to hospitals, right? But he may want to continue to run the urban hospitals, so he's stealing some of my money to put it in urban hospitals. What other things? Yeah.
Well, he may not be spending enough time in the rural areas, and that's why he's more aware of the deficiencies
Right.
in the urban areas.
Yep. He's not visiting the rural areas. Why is that? Okay, maybe he's an educated person who studied at Yale, comes from an elite family like many of the people that would have been in his government. He probably doesn't spend much time in the rural areas, and it's not a huge priority to him because these people are not likely to vote for him, right? Okay, so that's another thing that he might be putting the money into. So he needs to also possibly can make a contribution towards his own political party. He needs to get some money together in order to get some votes, get some people out delivering some leaflets, make sure people are incentivized to come in and vote. Okay, so there's some money that's gone missing at the center. Right, next bit of money is going to go missing at the district level. Anyone like to suggest where the money's gone at the district level?
Salaries?
Beautiful, salaries. Why has he got to steal the money to pay the salaries?
He's not collecting taxes.
He is not collecting taxes. He's not collecting taxes, which means that he has to get the money from the international donor. And what does the international donor not want to give him money for? Salaries, right? We hate the idea of giving money for salaries because it doesn't feel like it's sustainable. We worry that if we start supporting people's salaries, there's going to be no end of it. So we want to start investing in some innovative small clinic, but we don't want to be paying the salary bill because we don't really feel that's our job, right? Meanwhile, the medicines. Okay, I'm trying to get my head around why are the drugs not on the shelves in this place, right? Why are there no drugs on the shelves? So the drugs have been imported into the country, we believe, right? Some nice American company has got the contract for pharmaceuticals. There are contracts, there are invoices, there are receipts. The pharmaceuticals have arrived, right? Why have they not made it onto the shelves here? Sorry? Stolen? Yep, some has been stolen, yes. Huh? Lack of refrigeration. Very good. Beautiful. Remember, well, I've got that fan up there, which we spent a lot of money installing, but there's no electricity within 10 miles of this place, so you can't refrigerate anything, right?
Or roads again.
The roads? Who is supposed to be getting the pharmaceuticals into that place? I mean, whose actually job is it to get it from the capital city, from the airport to the clinic? Huh?
Hospital administrator.
Hospital administrator, or possibly a contract has been issued to somebody, right? Maybe somebody's won a contract in order to deliver it, but they don't deliver on the contract. What do you do when they don't deliver on the contract? Are they your cousin? Are they from your political party? What kind of sanctions have you got? Or does it turn out that the person who's in charge of actually running the dispensary in the clinic has their own private dispensary in the same village into which the medicines have now appeared? Okay, now, promise you we're coming towards an end here, right? Okay, now let's get back to our fixing our state. So we've just been here in health. I want to keep generating other things that you want to do in order to fix this state, right? What are the other things that you feel the state needs in order to operate? So we've got security. So we've got legitimate monopoly on the use of violence. I'm going to turn this into jargon. Right? We've got an effective civil service, got a decent financial administration. Somebody mentioned tax. We've got health and education, so we're investing in human capital to get the jargon together.
You need a judiciary or some means of resolving disputes.
Beautiful, 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 beautiful. Beautiful. So judiciary, I'm going to put it here as the rule of law. Rule of law. And maybe citizens' rights. How are we going to get the economy going? What do we need to get the economy going?
Microloans.
Huh? Microloans. Microloans. Let's get some microloans. Maybe we need a pragmatically regulated free market. Maybe we need some... Huh?
You need buyers.
Buyers. We need a market of some sort, yeah. Somebody who understands the culture there. That's more over here, yeah. Okay, now, the next problem is who are you, right? So you've arrived in this place. You're advising the governor. You're trying to do all this stuff. Who actually are you, right? And what are your problems? Right? You as UNICEF, you as the World Food Programme, you as the World Bank, you as USAID, you as a Yale University professor off on a 4-month thing, right? Okay, what are the problems that you face dealing with this governor? Give me one problem.
You don't speak the language.
You don't speak the language, correct. Right. This is not a trivial problem. This is not a trivial problem. There is a conceit in the international community that you don't need to speak the local language. There's some idea that the people that matter speak English. The fact is, in almost every developing country, that simply is not true. And certainly outside the capital city, it definitely is not true. And yet the statistics on this are absolutely horrifying. So in 2011, the height of the surge in Afghanistan, when there were 120,000 international soldiers and 100,000, I kid you not, 100,000 international civilian consultants, right? So nearly 220,000 foreigners on the ground. There were approximately 100 of those people who could speak an Afghan language fluently, right? Approximately 100. The scale of this problem is inconceivable, right? And that lack of linguistic understanding, of course, is also a deep, deep lack of cultural understanding. I mean, absolutely no idea whatsoever about the context. So we, and now including myself in this, turning up in this country, we are experts on governance in the abstract. We are experts on gender in the abstract. We are experts on education in the abstract, on economics in the abstract. What we are not experts on is gender in Afghanistan, education in Afghanistan, the economics of Afghanistan, because we don't know anything about Afghanistan. We don't know anything about Afghanistan. We can't speak the language. Why else don't we know anything about Afghanistan? Correct. We don't have any relationships that get us into doors. And what is the reason why we don't have any relationships, or one fundamental structural logistical problem? Transients, so short term.
We're not members of their tribe.
Mm-hmm. Putting relationships there. So short term, very, very serious problem. Right, so the average tour length of an American soldier in Afghanistan was 12 months. The average length of a British soldier was 6 months. The average tour length of an Italian soldier was 4 months. The average diplomatic posting was 12 months, extendable to 2 years, right? And then the next problem is what? What's the next problem when you want to go out and visit your governor and spend time in their place? Security, right? there's an insurgency going on. People are trying to kill you. People are trying to blow you up. You can only move around in an armored vehicle. You want to go and see the Department of Education to have a discussion with the Director of Education. You go along in 2 armored vehicles with 4 bodyguards who tell you that you can be in that office for an hour and a half before they have to extract you because they're worried that somebody's going to come and kill you. How easy is it, right? You turn up with your translator because you don't speak the language. You're there for a very short-term period. You're actually, if you're a civilian, almost certainly getting leave for 2 weeks every 6 weeks where you're removed from the country to try to stop you going crazy. So there's absolutely no continuity of anyone dealing with it. And you can only spend an hour and a half in the person's office and you're out again.
You're also typically, whatever organization you're with, has an agreement with one entity in that government. It may be the Department of Education. You often don't get to see the governor. You may get to see the corresponding regional entity, but, you know, partly for their self-defense against these transient outsiders, your agreement is with one, so it's all, the entry point is bureaucratized, and you can only deal with one part of.
Fantastic. Okay, so then there are these whole issues around bureaucracies, right? The issues around the stovepipe. The issues around the incentives of bureaucracies, right? I mean, what happens when you are the person on the ground, so you're out there on the ground, and you pretty rapidly determine that nothing very useful is getting done here. You're not really achieving very much, right? But you're sending your reports back to your boss, right? And there are one of 2 problems with saying that you're not achieving very much on the ground, right? One problem is that you're you're a middle-aged South African consultant trying to get away from your wife, and you're slightly worried that she might be sent back to South Africa if you keep sending in reports saying things aren't getting very far. Or the second problem is, somebody said, there is an existential threat to global security here. If Afghanistan falls, Pakistan will fall, mad mullahs will get their hands on nuclear weapons, right? At which point, failure's not an option. So, which brings us to the politics. So back home, somebody's got an idea of what they're trying to do with this place. I try to simplify it initially by suggesting that back home you could provide a humanitarian explanation for what you're doing in sub-Saharan Africa and a national security explanation for what you're doing in sub-Saharan Africa. But the reality is that the political justifications in Washington or in London or in Paris are lurching around and changing very, very rapidly. I mean, almost more rapidly than you can keep up with them. I remember feeling this very strongly when I was challenging the surge in Afghanistan. Right? I remember in 2011, we had the British embassy in Kabul as the largest British embassy in the world. And I said, what on earth do you think you're doing? Why on earth have you got the largest embassy in the world in Afghanistan? I mean, if you're worried about terrorism, Pakistan's more important. If you're worried about regional security, the Middle East is more important. If you're worried about poverty, sub-Saharan Africa is more important. What on earth are you doing with the largest embassy in the world in Afghanistan? And the answer was, look, if Afghanistan falls, Pakistan will fall, mad mullahs will get their hands on nuclear weapons, this is an existential threat to global security, right? 2013, I go to a meeting and they tell me that they're reducing the size of the embassy in Kabul, so it's going to become the 2nd smallest embassy that we have in that part of Asia. I said, what on earth are you doing? Why are you reducing it so small? It's going to be smaller than Nepal. Where are we going with this? And then they say to me, Rory, if you're worried about terrorism, Pakistan matters more than Afghanistan. Right? The whole thing moves like this. Right? Who knows whether at one time or another what you're really concerned about here is human rights, democracy in a full, rich, thick sense, or whether you're only concerned about holding elections. Who knows whether what you're really concerned about is defeating the Taliban or whether what you all really care about is killing Osama bin Laden. Who knows whether your government actually buys into that whole theory that I just sketched on Africa about migration, about epidemics, about labor potential, about raw materials, or whether the government is just committed to spending 0.7% of its GDP on international aid and is trying to find somewhere to park that money. And this presupposes, of course, that the politicians themselves have any clear answers to these questions. The answer, of course, the politicians, not being a highly distinguished room in Yale, may be quite busy people with many other things to think about. It may not have a fully analyzed and worked out logical theory on exactly what their position is on the Central African Republic, or exactly what they believe about the Rohingya in Myanmar. And the question of whether they're going to be focusing this week on Yemen or this week on South Sudan may have nothing to do with the objective conditions on the ground in Yemen or South Sudan, and may have a great deal more to do with what happens to be in the newspapers. Right. Now let me try to wrap this up and then move on to questions. So I began by saying that I came in as a new minister into international development. And I touched the edge of this wonderful idealistic vision which we carry with us of the transformation of other people's countries, the transformation of very poor countries, transformation of countries that are going through humanitarian catastrophes. I talked about the failures of development since the 1970s and talked about some of the reasons why we feel development has failed. We then began together, as a joint exercise, to sketch out conceptually what is involved in trying to describe the business of fixing a failed state. A little bit of an attempt to describe what an ideal state might look like and what the methodology might be in achieving it, which is where we generated this mapping of internal and external stakeholders, the definition of critical tasks, the mobilization of sufficient resource, and the measuring through iterative monitoring. We created 10 functions of a state, right, ranging from the legitimate monopoly on the use of violence through a good civil service, a good financial administration, investment in citizens' rights and responsibilities, investment in human capital, infrastructure, good management of state assets, international relations, pragmatically regulated free market, and the rule of law, right? And then we talked about the problems in trying to flesh those things out. So we took the example of health and corruption in health, and the problems of getting those drugs through to the clinic. Then we touched on who we are. I talked a little bit about us and them. And we can come back to us and them in a second. But who we are as individuals. Right? What languages do we speak? Where are we based? How long are we there? What kind of security constraints do we face? Talked a little bit about bureaucratic structures. What is it in the culture of bureaucracies that makes it difficult to mesh or interact? And then we reflected on the strange political lurches within the brains of the politicians. Which brings us back to the fundamental problem, right? The fundamental problem is that in many, many, many cases, we are dedicating ourselves to impossible projects, and projects which we cannot acknowledge as impossible, because we find it very difficult to take on board, leaving aside the ethical issues, leaving aside the deep moral problems with intervention, we cannot take on board the sheer practical implications of putting yourself in that governor's office in a remote part of Somalia, trying to turn around a society when a civil war is going on, when there's no electricity on the ground, and where you don't begin to understand the local structures, where all these things that you've mentioned, if I can get them, the importance of data, the importance of an inventory, the importance of trying to map who these stakeholders are, the census, all these things are close to impossible for you to achieve. There is no data in that part of Somalia. The records have been blown up or destroyed. You have no way of getting your researchers out into the field. You're not there for long enough. You simply cannot gather that information. The stakeholders that you unfortunately end up seeing end up, unless you're very, very careful, being a very, very arbitrary group of people, dominated by tribal chiefs who turn up and say, I am the chief of this tribe follows me, and the next day somebody else turns up and says, my cousin's bluffing, he's not the chief of the tribe, I'm the chief of the tribe. And the women that you are trying to deal with, right, your women that you're trying to interact with, in my case, we're trying to do this kind of consultation in Amara in Iraq. We set up a provincial council in which all the women sat at one end of the room in total silence with their headscarves on, didn't contribute to the political conversation at all. And then when one of them spoke up, she was dragged out of her car and executed the next day. Right? So the extremity of the problems you're dealing with, the problems, again, of myself dealing with Haider in Iraq, who was a young human rights activist who I helped finance his children's magazine and who I employed as a translator, who was himself dragged from his car and executed by the Salaries militia because he was working with me. Right? Problems which I haven't begun to touch on here, which go beyond this, which are problems of legitimacy, problems of what happens when an insurgency is going on, problems when a country perceives you as a foreign occupying force. Put all that together and then take on board the fact that sometimes these interventions work. And I'm going to finish with this because I want to finish on a slightly more optimistic note before we go on to questions. In Bosnia, when I arrived there, first, 1994, that country had faced a war in which over 100,000 people had been killed, in which nearly 1 million people had been displaced from their homes as refugees, in which there were 150,000 people under arms, in which there were about 85 checkpoints between Sarajevo and a town 100 miles north of Sarajevo, in which war criminals, like Mladic, were on the loose. Karadzic was on the loose. We intervened, the United States playing this very major part in it. Richard Holbrooke, playing as a former lecturer in this lecture series, played a very major part. And within 5 years, a very short period of time, against all the odds, 1 million houses had been returned to their original owners. The killing had stopped. The checkpoints had disappeared. The 150,000 people under arms had been reduced to 16,000 under arms. The war criminals had almost all been arrested and have since been prosecuted in The Hague. And the crime rate in Bosnia is today lower than Sweden. Right? That is a success, which is why the challenge for all of us moving forward is to try to work out how to combine the deep pessimism that might emerge from this kind of analysis with the strong understanding that it can be done, that it was done in Bosnia, to a lesser extent in Kosovo, in Sierra Leone, in Cambodia, and that if we can often do much less than we pretend, we can do much more than we fear. Thank you very much indeed.
You want to have your own questions?
Sure.
We have about a half an hour. So.
Great. Thank you all very much. Questions,
About
thoughts,
half an hour
challenge.
for questions, and let's try to have questions. Think statements at least that end with a question mark at the end of the sentence.
Sir, please.
I'd like to propose quickly an alternative development model and ask what you think of it.
Sure.
I'm China. I spend tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars throughout Africa. I build infrastructure in a seemingly altruistic way, but of course not, because they have extractive purposes. I care about absolutely none of the nonsense on the blackboard, and I run the table. How does that strike the folks in Whitehall?
Okay. So China, in relation to Africa, is very, very difficult for the West to process. So we don't know exactly how much China has spent in Africa over the last 20 years. Maybe 75 billion, maybe $100 billion, maybe more, because you're having to count the money that is spent directly by the Chinese government, money spent by state-owned enterprises, money spent by Chinese private businesses. The Chinese involvement in Africa is very deep. So many African countries now, you'll turn up, there may be as many as 150,000 Chinese citizens settled in the country, performing basic agricultural tasks, running shops, getting involved in construction. Go to somewhere like Zimbabwe, the airport has been paid for by China. The National Training College for the military has been paid for by China. Go to Ethiopia, most of the major road network has been installed and paid for by China. And so you will find African leaders saying that they are very keen that the United States or Britain behaved more like China. Right? there are African leaders who say to me that we don't want you coming in and talking about human rights, we don't want you talking about civil society, we don't want you talking about democratization. What we would like you to do is build us some roads, build our parliament building for us, build our airport for us, and above all, invest. We'd like some money coming into the country to get some jobs. Right? Now, at the same time, there are other African leaders who are beginning to get very frustrated with China and are beginning to feel that China has exploited them and abused them, that the Chinese model has been very one-sided. And there are people in China who are beginning to feel that they've lost a lot of money in Africa, that most of the loans they've made in Africa, a lot of the investment they've pumped into Africa isn't going to come good. These projects are never going to return the kind of investment they've put in. And where they are discovering, as we all discover, the limits of the kind of power. I mean, it's not quite clear what China is doing here, and one of the answers to this may be that China doesn't necessarily need to answer that question because their economy is growing so fast. They've got so much money, they don't even need to really worry about it. I mean, when people in Britain challenge me and say, what's China doing spending all this money? Why are you not out competing China? The answer is the Chinese economy is currently growing every year and a half about the size of the entire British economy. So they've got a certain amount of surplus money to be putting into these kinds of projects. But are they doing it in order to try to gain strategic advantage over raw materials? Possibly. So current estimates suggest, I was waving my iPhone around, that China currently owns about 75% of the world's coltan, about 78% of the world's cobalt, and about 85% of the world's rare earths. Right? So one way of interpreting this is a smart bet that these are the things that are going to matter for those objects of the future, and China needs to put a marker down on those things. And then the question, finally, even if you wanted to be China, what would American or British populations make of their governments trying to behave like China? So as a working politician, of course, my experience every day in Parliament is turning up and being challenged. Why are you not intervening in the civil war in Burundi? And I have to stand up and say in a slightly pompous way, we call on Burundi to respect UN resolution whatever, we call on them to respect the Arusha Accords, we call on them to work with the ex-Tanzanian Prime Minister who's currently gone out, and I sit down, and then somebody else stands up and says, what are you doing to resolve the situation in Western Cameroon? And then I have to stand up and say, we call on the Anglophone community of West Cameroon to resolve their political differences with the Francophone community, and in the end, the only solution to the conflict is through a political solution, but we call on everybody to respect the Constitution, restrain violence. And I sit down again, and the next guy sticks up and says, what are you doing about the situation in Togo, right? The point that I'm trying to make here is that my political culture doesn't enable me to say what a Chinese diplomat would say to me, which is, frankly, I don't really have a dog in the fight of who's winning in Burundi. I don't really have any control about what's happening in West Cameroon, and I'm not going to pretend to my public that these things are either things I can do much about or things that we have a particular national interest in pursuing. So I think those were some questions in response to China rather than answers on China, but it was a good question.
What lessons do you think we can learn from countries like Ghana or Botswana that have done relatively well with neighbors that really haven't?
Okay, so Botswana is a really, really interesting example. And Botswana, went from being down there with Malawi, one of the poorest countries in the world in the 1960s, to now being a middle-income country in Africa. A middle-income country with very little corruption, which was not destroyed by a resource curse. The normal idea is that if you are cursed with oil or diamonds, you get a Dutch disease and you're in a terrible trouble, but in fact Botswana was able to manage its diamonds. It's been able to get very, very good figures, not just on things like education, but on things like fertility rates. So whereas in Niger, the average family size is about 7.2, in Botswana they've managed to get it down to about 3.4 at the moment. But these are very, very impressive achievements that have happened in Botswana. And it's not immediately obvious what it is about Botswana that's allowing it to do it. let's move on to another couple of cases. Rwanda, Ethiopia, right? These are even more controversial. Botswana is one that we feel quite comfortable with because it's a democratic country where there have been nice democratic transitions every 8 years. But Rwanda, Ethiopia, very interesting. So Rwanda and Ethiopia, of course, if I had been doing this talk in the late 1980s, would have been right up there on the list amongst the 5 poorest countries in the world. But Ethiopia, of course, went through a famine, and of course in 1994, Rwanda went through this horrifying genocide. Since that time, those countries, through very authoritarian governments, have managed to double the GDP per capita of their countries. And Rwanda is genuinely remarkable. Ethiopia is genuinely remarkable. I mean, there are huge questions around the style of government. But my goodness, you walk into the clinics, they're working. You look at the roads, they're well repaired. It's clean. It's progressive. A lot of the investments seem to be bearing fruit. Even these strange government state-owned enterprises that we don't really understand. We'd want to sort of suggest that everybody should be following a Botswana model on private enterprise. In fact, Rwanda and Ethiopia, a lot of the money is spent by the army, and yet seems to be effectively spent by the army and be getting actual returns for people in those countries. But do we have any real way of explaining why that's working in Rwanda and it's not working in Burundi? And Burundi is basically a perfect comparison to Rwanda. Their histories are almost identical, their geologies, their geographies, the ethnic divisions between Tutsi and Hutu are almost identical between the two countries, and yet one of them's taken off and the other one is mired in miserable poverty and is sitting there as number 3 on my list. The answer on Rwanda and Ethiopia is supposed to be the inheritance of medieval state structures. So the theoretical answer that's proposed at the moment is that somehow they're drawing off a deep legacy of state control under an old Rwandan kingdom and under the Ethiopian kingdom. None of that, of course, applies to Botswana at all, right? That had none of those structures in place. Which is where you end up in this horrible question around leadership. And of course, this question, saying this is about leadership, or saying this is about avoiding corruption, is simply a tautology. And it's a completely empty statement, because it poses the prior question of, well, what style of leadership, or what is it that allowed it to involve corruption? In fact, a lot of what we propose as explanations are not really explanations at all. They're just other ways of stating the obvious. I mean, the classic example on corruption, let's say we say, how did Botswana avoid corruption, right? And the traditional answer to that is through transparent, predictable, and accountable financial processes, right? That doesn't tell you anything, right? Right? To say that a country has transparent, predictable, and accountable financial processes is just another way of saying it's not corrupt, right? It doesn't help you get anywhere closer to the core explanation. So the answer is, I'm thoroughly confused, and if you have an idea or an explanation, I'd like to put it forward. But the basic story is that in almost every developing country, to provide us a sort of slick answer to that, is that it's much, much easier to provide a convincing explanation of success than it is of failure. Right? Nobody can ever explain failure, and you saw that most clearly of all in the comparison between the surge in Iraq and the surge in Afghanistan. When the surge in Iraq worked, General Petraeus provided a very clear explanation for why it worked. When his surge in Afghanistan failed, there was no explanation at all. So, yeah.
I'm working currently in your poster country of Somalia.
Oh, terrific.
As a development consultant. The one thing that seems to be working, and you know, all the issues of understanding what's going on that you mentioned is very, very real. We fortunately have a very good group there that helps us try to understand the local context. But the one thing that seems to be working is the mobile phone system. And so the question I have is, should development, you know, look for things that are working and piggyback as much as possible on that, or should development really still say, okay, but the real problems are in the rural areas where even a lot of the adults don't even have a mobile phone, and they're herders, they have a diminishing number of goats that they're trying to survive with. Famine is where happened there, and you say, you know,
Okay.
on that, as hard as
So,
that is.
so this is a really, really central point, okay? Mobile telephones are a very good example of something that seems to work almost everywhere, right? The first big success, not just in Somalia, but in Afghanistan, was the mobile telephone system, right? The second thing that the international community, whatever the hell that means, seems to be able to do in these countries is stabilize the currency and set up a central bank, right? First thing they did in Bosnia, they're boasting about central bank, stable currency, Kabul, stable currency, central bank, Baghdad, stable currency, central bank. Right? What do these things have in common? Right? The mobile telephone system, the stable currency, the central bank. Generally what they have in common is they're quite techie engineering issues. They're generally things that foreigners sitting in a capital bringing best practice from somewhere else in the world are able to deliver. Right? They're not deeply rooted in complex issues of culture, tribalism, governance, the rule of law, civil society. In fact, it's one of the reasons why the Gates Foundation, I believe, is increasingly focused on health rather than education. Because certain kinds of health interventions, in particular immunization, appears to be relatively standard across many of these different countries, and it's relatively straightforward for the Gates Foundation to send out people who know how to do immunization, turn up in a country and really achieve some very dramatic improvements in health indicators. When it comes to education, highly politicized, the teachers' union, the curriculum, the low status of teachers, the way a rural school operates, girls, boys, all this kind of thing. So, what do we do with this fact? What do we do with the fact that there are certain kinds of things that we seem to be able to do well? Mobile phones, bank, some aspects of healthcare, and other things which seem to us more fundamental, more important, but which we really struggle to deal with. Rule of law, governance, corruption. My instinct is focus on that, right? Because I don't think you can do this stuff generally. It can be done, right? People within those countries can themselves sort out those problems. In different ways, Botswana, Rwanda sorted out those problems. Bangladesh is an extraordinary example of a country which, if I'd been talking to you in 1976, was the definitional basket case. You know, a country where 150,000 people could be killed in a single incident of flooding. Today, their flood emergency response is so good that you would probably only lose 500 people in a similar scale flood, and they're on the verge of becoming a middle-income country. And the employment rates have rocketed, and education rates have rocketed, and the microcredit schemes have worked, etc. Right? So countries can begin to sort out some of these things. Bangladesh, perhaps not a great example of sorting out those particular things I read on the blackboard, but other things they have sorted out. But I do not think these are things that foreigners are going to be very good at sorting out. And the reason why is because of all these kinds of things. It's because of who foreigners are. I mean, the people that are likely to be able to deal with these root problems of rule of law, governance, corruption, are going to be people from within that culture. In particular, local political leaders. We talked about us and them. And the fundamental problem for us and them, if I can find it again, which I can't, is that generally in the way in which we have thought about other people's countries, we have overemphasized us and we've underemphasized them. We've tended to assume that we are heroic, brilliant interveners with all this best practice that's going to come and do the capacity building, and that they are a little bit foolish, right? Generally, the places that have worked, Bosnia is a very good example of this, they worked for exactly the reasons that we thought they wouldn't work. Right? So we thought the problem in Bosnia was that the foreign military was not more active. In fact, in Bosnia, the secret was that the foreign military wasn't more active because it gave more space to local political actors. We thought the problem in Bosnia was that too many deals were cut with extremist political parties. Almost certainly, giving the responsibility to local political actors and forcing them to cut deals with extremist political parties is actually what led to the political solution in Bosnia. Right? So it's them that's going to be able to sort that stuff out. And it's us that should try to focus on the things that we can do, right? Which is why I am quite a believer, just to annoy everybody in this room even more, in humanitarian relief work, right? Obviously, humanitarian relief work sounds dumb. Humanitarian relief work sounds absurd, right? What on earth are you doing providing cash transfers or shelter or food to starving people? Surely what you should be doing is addressing the deep underlying root structural issues that caused the famine in the first place. And you should be creating the sustainable economic development so that you don't have to do that, so that the country concerned can do it. Now, of course, logically that's true. Of course, if a country is able to do what China did, right, get itself into the state of wealth that China's in now, it doesn't need any humanitarian relief from anyone. It can look after itself, in fact, and go around providing humanitarian relief to other people's countries. But I don't think that we can do that, we in this room, right? And insofar as we can't do that, then I think it's actually a very good idea to go around providing humanitarian assistance to people and not worrying too much about the fact that we haven't addressed the root causes that led to it. So, yeah, I'll provide shorter answers. I'm sorry. Yeah.
So I wonder if you have models or evidence for how the things that you're saying we can do can facilitate improvements in these indigenous activities, so that, for example, people build social capital because of cell phones. IT enables growth of education.
Yeah. Yeah. So this, I think, is what the gentleman was probably getting onto, and that's exactly right. So, of course, the point is to then think deeply about the way in which you might be able to use something like the setting up of a good mobile telephony system in Somalia to achieve many other things. And that could be, in the case of Kenya, of course, the M-Pesa system on banking. It could be a very good project I saw in northeast Nigeria, which was using weather data in order to create good, simple insurance models for farmers with their crops. It could be, in the case of Somalia, actually beginning to get information out about the famine and the drought through the use of those mobile telephones. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the secret is focus on what we can do and then making the most of what we can do. But that still will fall short of being able to address some of the issues that will continue to feel the fundamental. The lady at the back, yeah.
If your concerns are not only the moral ones,
Yeah.
helping people who are in need, but security, going back to
Yeah.
your statement, an hour ago about migration and the enormous security issues that would be associated with famine and drought and all those kinds of things in sub-Saharan Africa. We have a choice of putting up a wall. I mean, figuratively putting up a wall and saying, we'll defend against those problems, but we won't try to work to solve them because we can't. Or we have to find a middle ground. And it has to be something, I think, other than hoping that the countries in which you're developing a mobile telephone network and better immunization and tinkering with other small things, you're betting that they're going to be on the same time frame in turning their countries around that we need for our own security.
Okay.
I didn't say that very
Yeah.
clearly.
No. But the point is a very, very fundamental one, and it's a fundamental problem with my position, right? It's a fundamental problem with my position. So essentially what's being said there is, look, if these countries genuinely pose a serious threat to global security, then what I'm proposing here isn't going to cut it. Because essentially what I'm saying is that these countries here, those 5 countries on the left and most of those countries on the right, are probably likely in 25, 50 years' time, most of them still to be quite poor, quite fragile, quite traumatized, still have quite a lot of ungoverned space, still have quite a lot of areas that are likely to either generate regional conflicts and wars, or perhaps in the worst case generate ungoverned space where terrorists could thrive or push large amounts of migrants through into Europe. if the population, if 40% of the children born in the world by 2050 are going to be in sub-Saharan Africa, and if there are going to be no jobs in sub-Saharan Africa, then it seems perfectly plausible that by 2050 you could, of course, have 150, 200, 300 million Africans trying to move into Europe. So, of course, what I'm saying in that sense is quite pessimistic. I'm saying that we can't, I'm afraid, create jobs for those people. We don't know how to do it. If we knew how to create jobs for 18 million Africans a year, we wouldn't have the problems we have in Greece and Spain at the moment.
So we should be concentrating on how to absorb. We should be planning now for how to absorb.
Yeah. We should be planning for the worst case scenario. We should be assuming that we do not have it within us to achieve the kind of radical transformations. We're not going to be able to create full employment in Africa. We're not going to be able to turn Malawi in the next 50 years into South Korea. I mean, I don't think, right? And therefore, we need a plan for the worst. At the same time, we also need to be aware of the fact that maybe the threat posed is not as extreme as we sometimes suggest. That often things that we say are existential threats to global security may not be existential threats to global security. We may present them as such because, and I feel this as a politician, because we're trying to justify our aid budget or explain to the public why we're spending all this money on international aid. So we tend to overemphasize the threats that could be posed.
I think we have time for one more.
Good point, right. I'll stop. I'll take two and answer them together. Go on, sir. Yeah.
The cases that you mentioned
Yeah.
at the end of your talk that were success cases for international intervention, you mentioned Bosnia
Yeah.
and later
Yeah.
you gave
Yeah.
the indication of why.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned Kosovo
Yeah.
and Cambodia.
Yeah.
I wonder if you'd like to extend your argument for Bosnia to those two cases
Yeah.
and maybe mention East Timor if you can.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether the relative inactivity of the foreign forces
Yeah.
is a reason for the success of those three cases.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's the
Yeah.
case.
Sir at the back. Yeah.
How would you grade Prime Minister May's handling of Brexit?
It's a very, very charming questions. I mean, lots from the back there. So that was beautifully inserted. I think I'm going to dodge that one. I think it's slightly off the subject of the thing. But maybe we could talk about it afterwards over a drink. I'd be happy to do that. Okay, let me finish on the question that's been posed around East Timor, Kosovo, Bosnia. I suppose, and Cambodia. I suppose my gut instinct is that, number one, we were wrong, or people were wrong, who concluded in Iraq, for example, that cumbersome UN coalition operations are inferior to US-led coalitions with a much more aggressive military posture. In many ways, the things that seem so frustrating in those countries, which are that troops in Bosnia were very reluctant to deploy from their bases. This was true in Kosovo too. There were more injuries to American soldiers on the baseball court in Sarajevo than were suffered in any form of contact with the enemy. Right? In retrospect, were virtues, because they actually compelled local political actors to play the role and rebuild their own societies. The useful role played by the militaries often in these situations, in Kosovo, for example, were moving behind Kosovo civil society organizations that were moving to do refugee return with the troops coming along behind them, and then drawing back and then moving forward again. Right? In the case of Kosovo and Bosnia, too, very, very important to understand that we, the international community, are one factor alongside other perhaps more important factors. I've mentioned local leadership, but also regional power politics, what the neighbors are doing, what the European Union was able to offer as a carrot to draw people in. On East Timor and Cambodia is beginning to push outside my area of expertise, but I would say that my gut instinct is that the light footprint approach is the correct one, that the surge is almost always a mistake, because the surge is generally an attempt by the foreigner through massive deployment of resources and troops to impose their will on a recalcitrant situation. The only hope of success, I think, has to be the light footprint that necessarily forces local political actors to take the lead. In other words, to conclude, in relation to all of this, probably, as indeed with much of the rest of the world, the wisdom is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. Thank you very much indeed.